Are you still waiting for the one? Should I present first?
Yeah.
And then we'll wait for the other panel speakers. Hi, everybody. Thanks for that introduction and thanks for the invitation to speak. So this is, I'm speaking on behalf of the South African Wind Energy Association. And I've got a few slides just to talk about what we've done so far and what we think about jobs of the future. And then I think the plan is for me to join a panel with a few other people, and I think we're waiting for those people to arrive here. So can you all hear me clearly at the back? Great. So I shouldn't be using these slides, but these notes. This is for the tough questions you might ask me later. Okay, so if I can go to the next slide. So just, I think the first question that I've been asked at this table is, tell us what you've been doing so far. Don't come to us and talk to us about a talk shop about what you would like to do and what you will do and what you'd like to consult and stakeholders, etc. Tell us what you've done. So this is the wind industry's achievements over the first decade of wind energy in South Africa, which we're really proud of. There are 34 wind energy projects. All of them are operational. The last few became operational at the beginning of this year. And you can see the total installed capacity. We've obviously brought wind energy online during an environment where load shedding has been a disruptive feature in the economy, in many of our lives. It's made a reasonable contribution. And the very interesting thing about wind energy is that out of all the renewable energy generated in the country, wind and solar, 54% of the actual electricity is from the wind sector. And a lot of wind energy is generated in the later hours and in the evening, which is the peak load, which is one of the biggest issues around load shedding. Is load shedding tries to move the load around and reduce it so that they can manage the peaking ramp in the evening, and that's our utility. On the transformation side, the positives are that a huge amount of the investment in wind has been domestic investment from local banks, equity investors. We've achieved 33% black shareholding in the projects. And I think the thing that we're proudest of here is that apart from the carbon emissions, et cetera, which, when people think about wind energy, they think about the climate change impact, is the economic impact, is in terms of jobs created, a lot of the jobs in wind, it's a very civil engineering intensive construction. Because if you've ever driven past a wind turbine in the Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, or Western Cape, the hub height's now sitting at 100 meters. There's a massive foundation that's cast. And some of the foundation work will take 6 to 8 months to get done in order to hold up a steel tower or concrete tower. And in operations, what's interesting, and I'll talk about that some more, is the kinds of jobs which we didn't think about when the industry started 10 years ago, which are happening now, and some of the jobs of the future. But the other thing is that wind energy, apart from being cleaner, is also very cost competitive, and it's the reason why it's such a highly adopted form of energy across all markets in the world. In South Africa, between 2012, the first wind projects, and the latest round, the price has reduced by half. The average price is around R1.21, but it's reduced from 188 cents to 94 cents at the moment. And it's set to go even lower, we hope, because one of the big issues, and I'll talk about that, is how do you keep wind tariffs competitive? So if I can go to the next slide, please. So this is a wind map of South Africa. And sorry, my slide isn't very clear, so I'll try and talk to what you can't see. The chart in the middle is a map of South Africa, but that map and the different colors, what you're seeing is the best potential wind resource as it's spread out over the country. So dark red means best wind. Orange, yellow means good, strong wind. As you move to blue, it means less strong wind. But South Africa as a country has one of the best wind resources globally. And it has a lot of land available for wind farm development, which is why it's such a great market. The other important part of developing wind projects for energy is that you need very good transmission lines to move the electricity from where it's being generated to where it's being needed. In South Africa, our highest or our largest load is in the Gauteng region. And from the map and from the chart at the bottom, The two provinces that have taken the highest number of wind energy projects are the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape. The Western Cape follows third, and you can see that the Northern Cape is blessed in two ways, because not only does it have amazing wind resource, good transmission lines, it has somewhat the best solar resource in the world. So the Northern Cape is uniquely gifted in that sense from all of our provinces. And as you move further away towards Mpumalanga province, where we are blessed with coal, you'll see that the wind resource is not so strong there. The solar resource is not strong either, but both wind and solar projects can also be developed in Mpumalanga. The chart on the right is more interesting because it talks to, one of the discussion themes in this Imbizo is around what can we do from a policy perspective. The picture on the right is Eskom's current grid capacity, and that's a paper that was released by Eskom and on their website a few weeks ago. And the Northern Cape, because it had such a low population, such a low electricity load, it's never needed a very good transmission network. It's got a very strong rail line to move iron ore for export. And it's had some mining activity, but it hasn't had such a high transmission network, such a highly invested transmission network as the rest of the country. As a result, all of the Northern Cape's grid capacity, the number that's written there that you can't see underneath Northern Cape is 0 megawatts. So there are more than 50 projects which are ready to start construction and to be bid into any renewable energy program, or to be providing electricity across the country to a mine that reads into renewable energy, but there's no grid capacity left in the Northern Cape. And that's not because Eskom doesn't want to build a grid, it's because it requires more capital and it requires time, and it's one of the things which we can improve on from a policy certainty and planning perspective. On the top right, provinces like Limpopo and Mpumalanga, they have grid capacity available, but it's not the strongest resource. So what does that mean is there's going to have to be a trade-off between, do you try and get wind and solar and new generation in that part of our country at a slightly higher tariff because you've got grid capacity, but it's not the strongest resource. Because basically, all of the renewable energy that's been built in the country has been done on a competitive auction basis. The projects that government awards, which have a long-term contract to supply to consumers via Eskom, is the lowest tariff that meets certain criteria for economic development, etc. And with economic development, I think the big thing that the wind industry has done, sorry, the chart you can't see on the left is actually the dots of where all of the projects are, but the table points those out. Eastern Cape and Northern Cape have been taking the lion's share, with Western Cape far behind. We hope that in this next round, or the Round 5 award, which was awarded in November last year, the first wind project will be built in KZN. And it doesn't mean that wind and solar won't get to the other provinces. It will get there too. It's just going to be done at a smaller scale and maybe not at the same competitive tariff. If I can move to the next slide, please. So the other question I was asked to come and talk to was around policy opportunities and as a discussion point. There's an interesting paper which was done 2 years ago around job creation and what are the opportunities for wind. And at this table, we were chatting about each country needs to make up its own destiny around climate change and what that energy transition looks like. But this study was a very South African-centric study, and what it said is that by 2050, moving on an accelerated basis towards wind and solar being the lowest cost energy would drive a net jobs gain versus losing jobs. So I think I take your point, which is, what does that path look like in the short term and what term is short? But the important thing is, I think on the policy opportunity, the country has made a very brave step by, when this paper was written, the IRP in its current form wasn't adopted, the Integrated Resource Plan. We now have a very clear path which says wind and solar are going to be big drivers of the energy mix in the country. We're going to rely on a reducing basis on coal. We also have provision for other forms of energy in the energy mix, in the energy plan, which is nuclear and gas, and some of that has to be worked out. But the great thing about wind is that it's actually generating jobs, it's creating a whole supply chain, a whole value chain in the country, and that needs to continue. And in renewable energy, the very interesting thing is about the nature of jobs, and I'll talk about that in my next slide. The thing about coal, and this is what I want to spend a few minutes about because I'm not here to speak on behalf of the coal industry, but what's happening globally in the coal industry, and now is a very important time because of what's happening with the war between Russia and Ukraine and its impact on energy markets. But the coal industry has seen a gradual decline in labor intensity over years, which is going to continue. So the coal industry is shedding jobs without the pressure from renewable energy. And that was also in the paper. But I encourage you to read about it and to form your own views. If I can move to the next slide. So this is kind of the wind energy life cycle, which is you start out prospecting or basically looking for good wind sites, which is where are the good transmission lines, where's the best wind on that map. You go out, you talk to landowners, you negotiate, you get environmental permits approved, etc. And then in development, you bid. So that's a range of the jobs. 82% of the jobs over the last 10 years, I've told you, have been in the construction phase, which is a very rapid burst of 2 years. And a wind farm goes up from clearing a site to putting it up. And then the business that I'm in at the moment, we do a lot of operations and maintenance work. All the jobs underneath operations and maintenance, plant manager, is what we thought we would need when we started. This is in 2012. The block on the left is what we didn't realize we would need. And in 10 years, those are new roles that have come up. Some of them are very interesting because they're very new economy roles like data scientists, people who are analyzing performance data, writing machine learning algorithms to actually tell the technician on site what's happening. And yesterday, I was fortunate enough to have a few people from SOEC visit our office and see our remote operations center. And we're very proud of it because we started it out as a trial in 2015. And we believe we're the only company in South Africa that is not relying on somebody in another market like India or Southeast Asia or China to do this remote monitoring for us. We're doing it in South Africa, and we have developed and grown a team to do it here. The highlighted block on the top left, the text box, which is decommissioning, repowering, we haven't even started that yet because our industry, the original wind farms, the original life is set to last until the mid-30s, 2030s, and then until 2040. In the late 2020s, we'll start planning for either repowering or decommissioning. And there's going to be a huge industry in recycling wind blades. Overseas, they're being used for things like bus stops, bicycle stands in mass urban transit areas. And there's also repowering, in other words, where they take down an existing wind farm, which is at a 90-meter hub height, and put up bigger turbines and generate more electricity out of the same site. And then, of course, I think the big thing for South Africa is the wind industry is very proud of its local content achievement, which is in my slide up front. But government set a target of 40%. The wind industry said we commit to achieve at least 43%, and it's done 47%. So the local content has been quite significant over the last 10 years. And what the industry is saying is we want to get to between 56 and 61% by 2030. And not just in civil construction, for instance. We also want to get into the manufacturing side. And there's a very interesting discussion which I think needs to be accelerated between business and government, which is around what form does that take? Because we need to build an industrial policy that will create jobs, but it also plugs South Africa into the global supply chain, where South Africa becomes a supplier of choice for wind energy turbine components across the world. Like we do, for instance, with right-hand drive cars in certain markets where we are manufacturing much more than South Africa will ever need, but we're selling to a much bigger market because we're selling to the right-hand drive market across the world. My next slide, please. So this is my last slide talking about what we think about jobs of the future. We're very proud of what we've achieved in the first 10 years. We think we can do a lot more. We think what we would like government to do from a policy perspective is be quite clear and committed. We have an integrated resource plan, but we think that those of you who follow the industry would know that bid round 5, there was a gap between bid round 5 and bid round 4 of 7 years. In that 7 years, businesses which had set up to manufacture wind towers, etc., shut down because the 7 years was too long for them to sustain a business while the entire program had ground to a halt. Now that the program has started again, we're saying to government, you need to be much braver. You need to say, not only here is round 6, which was just announced 2 weeks ago, but we're clear about round 7, round 8, round 9, round 10. And if there's a massive program ahead, then we will encourage international investors to set up manufacturing capability in South Africa, which would be great opportunities for South African entrepreneurs to partner with them. The thing about the youth is we think that our industry is also a good example of where a lot of these jobs and the experience didn't exist. And through very successful internship programs and learning programs within the industry, we've created a very successful group of young wind technicians or wind industry professionals, we think, who can work anywhere in the world, but who are very well positioned to lead the industry as it drives the energy transition of South Africa. That's it. So should I take questions now, or are there other people from the panel here? Any questions? I'm going to keep my cheat sheet notes with me now.
So you said you're very proud of what you've done. Do you have stats for us?
I thought we put it up on the first slide.
I didn't.
Okay, we can go back to it. You can put that up, please, the first slide with the first 10 years. Yeah.
So like in terms of jobs, so how many, is this for your company?
No, this is the entire industry. I'm speaking on behalf of the wind energy industry, but I can tell you about my company. So at the moment, we employ about 100 people in the country. 96% are South African, 85% work in the operations business, the business that I'm in. But I think the thing that we're quite proud about, which is, like I said, the industry didn't have a lot of these skills. We started out figuring out what skills do we need, how do we get them, and how do we take them where people have basically got zero experience, but we acknowledge that globally there's not a lot of experience. So why don't we just grow our own homegrown talent? So we started 2 programs, a scholarship and an internship program in 2014 and 2015. And the numbers from those is, on internships, we have 10 interns in place at the moment, but we've taken 85 through internship programs. 80% of them have permanent roles within the broader industry. 40 of them, they've got their sign-off as their in-service training with national diplomas in electrical or mechatronics with us. And we employed 13 as permanent employees. We couldn't hang on to 5 because they got better jobs somewhere else and they left. But 8 are still with us, and 1 is actually one of our most senior technical managers. She manages 3 of our solar parks in the Northern Cape. So that's just the internship program. The scholarship fund was launched in 2014. That's the Global X Scholarship Fund. And we've awarded 21 million rand in bursaries, 273 bursaries. And there we focused on mechatronic and electrical engineering bursaries nationally. And then what we've done, we've got to work within a 50-kilometer radius of our renewable energy projects. So they've been focused mainly on the Northern Cape and Eastern Cape. And we've done agriculture and nursing bursaries as well, but on a limited basis. Most of them are mechatronics and electrical.
Good evening, everyone. You told me to stop calling you Mr. Deson. I asked you this question yesterday.
Yeah.
I'll ask you again, but in more detail. The manufacturing capacity of the renewable sector in South Africa is not up to date compared to other countries like China, Germany, and the likes.
Yes.
So how are we then going to phase out the jobs in the fossil fuel industry towards the renewables industry, number one? And what do those jobs look like? And how is the value chain going to look like? Is it going to still be predominantly white-owned, or is there going to be black people and in general and youth in particular?
Very complex questions. So let me try and break it down. So I think the first one is about jobs versus fossil fuels. And I think that's a very complex discussion where a lot of it's about forecasting what's going to happen to the coal industry. And like I said, when I spoke, is I think before renewables came on the scene, if you look at the labor market in coal globally, it has slowly been shedding jobs as it's become less labor intensive. There's another whole question, which is about, if you speak to people in the coal industry, and there's a fascinating documentary, by the way, which is available on YouTube. It came out last week. It's by TIPS. And it's about, the energy transition and what is a just transition. So it's filmed in Mpumalanga and the Witbank area around where the communities most impacted by the mines shutting down are going to be. And apart from, obviously, the health aspects of the people who live there, what they're concerned about is that government is talking about a just energy transition, but is still granting mining rights to coal companies. And they find that difficult to understand because some companies have invested in projects like agriculture, which are driving a little bit of enterprise development and self-sustaining jobs in that area. So when it comes to jobs, I can't give you a clear answer. I can tell you that paper that was written in 2019 is quite illuminating to read because it's written, without any bias, where it's not a lobby group trying to say, this is what's better from an energy perspective. It's trying to answer the question, where will we end up on a jobs basis and what will those jobs look like? The two things I took away from the paper is, yes, I'm not personally affected because I don't have family, who live and work in the Witbank and Mpumalanga area. But the country is going to be net better off in terms of jobs in a long time. The second thing is the quality of the work is going to be different. It is going to be for skilled people. It's not going to be people working in a coal mine, which is a very difficult job to do and a very unsafe job to do. So those are the two things I took away from the paper. On the second point is I think that it's a criticism I've heard a lot. The industry is white-owned. The industry is not making enough strides in terms of transformation, in terms of black ownership. I think I take the view that, yes, it is very dominated by white engineers, entrepreneurs, but I think there are very good success stories, especially in the last 5 years of the first 10 years, where, the guys and girls who started out either a side hustle while they had a full-time job or just persisted, they have actually done really well in terms of where they are now in the renewable energy program. And there's very good examples of those. We don't profile them, but I gave you an example when we chatted yesterday. There's more, who've won, especially in rounds 4 and 5. And if you tell me that, is the industry going to look the way it did 5 years ago, I'll tell you no. In 10 years, it's going to be radically transformed. You're going to see a lot more black entrepreneurs as owners of big businesses, I hope. And I think a big part of that is, we need to have a very consistent and aggressive industrial policy. And that is where I think we need to challenge government that it needs to be more deliberate about how it does that. It can't throw it up to the industry and say, you come up with a plan.
No, thank you so much, Des. And I think from my end, what I want to ask is the following. What is your take on the integrated resource plan at the moment? That is number one. Number two, what does the future for wind energy as well as solar energy look like? So from, do you in one day think that we would be transitioning as a country to an arena where wind energy accounts for about 60% of our base load, such as coal? And in the event that that is the future you think that we are going to be headed to, how do we deal with that question of 33% black SA shareholding when the demographics in the country depict that we've got a lot of black people? So how do you then radically transform that space from the onset? And this is taking into account the fact that wind farms are capital intensive, obviously. And the last question that I am going to pose is, would Africa be a good market in the event that we decide to either establish manufacturing hubs of our own, particularly for the wind turbines, or if we are to bring foreign investors to establish their hubs here for the rest of the continent? Those are my questions.
Okay. So, on the first question is, I think that South Africa's exposure to load shedding, a big part of the exposure, you can blame it on government, you can blame it on state capture, on bad planning. But a big reason for load shedding, which is a technical reason, is over-reliance on one technology and on an aging technology, internationally. So I think South Africa would be best served by diversifying. It should have different sources of energy. And I don't think it should be wind or solar. I think it should be a variety of those. But energy at the lowest cost drives the economy. And that's the big thing that I've learned in all of my studies about energy policy. So that's the first point is I think wind can do more, but I think the exciting thing that's happening in energy markets all over the world is the discussion about green hydrogen. And it's where you use renewable energy to produce hydrogen, and you use hydrogen as a fuel, as an alternative to gas. And our business, Globelec, not the Wind Energy Association, we develop, own, and operate energy projects across Africa. We operate in 8 countries, and we do gas projects. We're busy starting a gas project in Mozambique, for instance. We think that the combination of gas and renewables is very powerful for the region to solve our energy issues because you have very cheap power which comes online very quickly in the form of wind and solar. And when the wind and solar need to be balanced out with gas, you can use gas very spontaneously to bridge that gap. And to get to your other point about the black shareholding, am I happy about that? No. Do I think it needs to be a majority position? Yes. Do I think it should be 70 or 80%? That's where I hope it will go to. But that's not going to happen by asking for it. It's going to happen by engaging, by doing what you're doing, being an activist, talking to government and saying, we want high thresholds, talking to the industry and saying, we really want to, get into your industry. How do you do that? I think those are the difficult questions. When the first round of renewables started, there were a lot of our South African finance institutions like the Development Bank of South Africa and the IDC that got involved with the original community trust funding, etc. I think they should be doing more to support entrepreneurs, to support if you've got a youth investment group that wants to get into the industry, you should be lobbying them and saying, look, this is what we will do. This is not a side hustle for us. We are committed to doing this. We will learn. We will make it work. We will study. But we are hungry. We're passionate. And we want to get in. But we need the capital backing. So you promised me there were no easy questions. So I'm not surprised by any of those.
I think I have an easy question.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah. My question sort of speaks to the point on industrial policy that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Looking at that 80 billion rand figure, it looks like a large number, but I think over a decade it's not sufficient, especially because you talked about how there's a lot of divestment away from coal. And especially now, a lot of investors are moving away from the dirty energy resources. And my concern is, in an economy that's founded on this mineral energy complex, is this divestment from coal, from oil and gas, translating into local and international investors moving into investing in South African renewables? Or are we just going to deal with a problem where there's divestment away from our energy sector in an era where we have an energy crisis? Like, is the renewable energy sector getting adequate investment? And if not, what does the government do from an industrial policy standpoint to make our renewable sector more attractive? So it's not just, the IDC pouring money into it. So it's a genuinely thriving and attractive sector for investment.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. And my background, by the way, is I'm not an engineer. I started out in this business in the investment side, originally investing in infrastructure investments in the transport sector, and then my first energy investment was in 2007 and in renewables in 2008. So I approached this from an investment perspective, and the reason I was attracted to infrastructure investing because of its impact on the economy, on jobs, etc. But the first response I have is that we can't change what's happening globally. And globally, the shift away from coal mining and from carbon-intensive fuels is already happening. So the deleveraging, and the reason, even on the South African exchange, that you have companies separating their coal assets from their other assets is because they recognize that it may work in certain markets, but global markets don't want exposure to those assets anymore. So we have very little ability to influence that as a country. And so I'm saying you can't change the direction of investment flow by saying, we still want to invest in coal. Because South Africa is now an integrated investment market. Money flows in and out, instantaneously. So I think you should be, the question we should be asking is how can we get more investment in renewable energy? And how can we target that investment to create 10 times more jobs than we have done? Some of that is, I think, about this manufacturing and local content discussion. But I think South Africa should be very strategic about how it does this. If we try and say, look, South Africa, you've got 10 years of wind energy coming up, and we want you to have 80% local content. There's a very interesting paper which was written recently, which says South Africa has sometimes adopted this import barrier approach to economic policy, which is saying, if you want to do business in our country, then these are the rules. Otherwise, you can't do business in our country. A smarter way of doing it is to say, South Africa wants to do business with the world. And we will do something which works well for the rest of the world, like manufacture a nacelle or transformer, which Siemens then buys. And instead of selling 20 of those transformers in South Africa in 1 year, you're selling 200 of them into the global market. So what do we need to do? We think that means that there needs to be incentives, tax incentives, investment incentives to encourage that. And South Africa's got to be more deliberate. Business and government have got to sit down and actually work out these details. It's got to be less of a high-level discussion and very specific. What are the key components? We have a competitive edge, and we can do them better than most other markets, and at least on par with China and India, because that's who we're competing with. Sorry, very long response to a very good question.
The mic is this side, sorry.
No.
So my question is, these wind turbines, are
Yes.
they on privately owned land or are they on municipal land? And if they are on privately owned land, what are the consultation processes like?
Can you go? Oh, there's nobody there. There's actually quite a detailed environmental assessment and community stakeholder process, which starts well before construction. And that's what I was speaking about, the permitting side. So, there's recorded stakeholder meetings. The land it depends. In the Northern Cape, we've got a mixture of, some of our sites are on land which is owned by community property associations. So land reform, transfer ownership. Some of it is private land. It's not municipal land. It's owned by farmers. On wind farms particularly, solar parks are much smaller in terms of how much land they need. But wind farms are massive because the turbines themselves have to be at a certain distance from each other so that the blades don't create this wake effect where they disturb each other. So typically a wind farm could have anything up to 10 different landowners on it, combination of private, government, etc. And typically the land is not bought, it's leased. So the owner of the land actually gets a percentage of the revenue that the wind farm generates, which is quite lucrative. Not a lot, but some of the Eastern Cape farmers have basically realized that their land is more valuable renting it as a wind farm than farming sheep. And the sheep are still there. They can graze without any damage.
Good afternoon to everyone, once again. My question is more like outside the box in this sense, because we all understand that the IPPs are quite a problem, for other people who are already in the energy production. So basically, we will know that there is a bit of commotion in that sense. But now, just like a solution out of the box, why wouldn't we focus more on economies which don't have a stronghold in energy? For instance, Eskom is currently supplying a number of countries in the SADC region. And those countries don't have infrastructure on production, which is why they tend to import our energy. So to be able to create jobs, which we do need jobs in the country, but at the same time have a stability in terms of where we're going. Because I think what we need to achieve somewhere close to what Bill Gates and them they talk about is like by 2060, we should be at least be at net zero. At net zero doesn't necessarily mean that we have to decommission all our mining coal operations. Because net zero means that I produce this much, but at the same time I must be able to supplement this much so that I can meet a net zero carbon emission. So from that point of view then now, in the sense that South Africa is heavily invested in infrastructure which has to do with coal, Medupi and all that, there are still projects which are still under construction in that sense. So meaning that those would decommission maybe the next 40 years. And the next 40 years is 2060, when we need to be at net zero. So wouldn't it be a solution then to focus more on the economies, South African investments, by the way, with the skills and all those kind of belonging to us, as you've mentioned that your company has an in-house, off-site monitoring, meaning that we don't need to go establish everything in Zimbabwe or everything in Botswana. We can do that in South Africa, but making a point that we are selling our energy where it matters the most. Because in South Africa, we do have energy. It's just a matter of saying that fix Medupi, fix whatever needs to be fixed, because it exists anyway. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a very good point. It's a good point. The two things I just want to comment on is the one I think is South Africa is not trying to get to net zero. We've got a nationally determined contribution which was submitted into the talks in Glasgow next year. And this year at the next COP27 discussion, it's the first time it's going to be in Africa, it's in Egypt, is South Africa each year will be refining that. But that takes into account Medupi and Kusile continuing and a gradual reduction in coal usage, which is in line with Eskom's plan. So there's nothing, when I talk about accelerating renewable, let me be clear, I'm not saying do anything different to what Eskom is already planning for its coal stations. I'm saying where the country needs to be more deliberate is about, okay, so what are we going to do in the wind industry globally, from a local content perspective? And yeah, that was it. Somebody else had their hand up?
Yeah. So my question would be around the shareholding. So how usually does the financing of these large projects usually go about? And is it much necessary that we need to get into international players because there's not funding or enough funding in South Africa? Because I understand why there's such a small share of black shareholders when the demographics are different in a situation where you're needing large capital outflows, where you know that black people in this country don't really have large capital outflows that they're just sitting on like that. And I'm interested in startups, and one of the interesting companies which I've seen is called Sun Exchange. I'm not sure if you're aware of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically what they do is they have projects where they have solar panels that are installed, but what they do is they have a crowdfunding model which allows people to buy a cell within that whole solar panel thing, and then from there on you can get your income from that. So yeah, what about the exploration of something like that as a model to try and capitalize these projects that are going on?
Yeah. So those are two different questions, so let me try and separate them. So firstly, a large amount, these projects typically, if you just think about each project, a wind project is, let's say, 2 billion rand. 80% of the capital has come from a consortium of banks. Most of those banks are the South African banks. 20% only is equity. Now, the equity capital is higher risk and higher return. The banks get paid first. So if the wind doesn't blow for a few years in line with what you forecast, your return is going to be lower as an equity investor, but your return as a bank investor is guaranteed. So the issue is not just about, have black entrepreneurs had capital because they've had to, provide sureties, et cetera, to say, well, what happens if the wind doesn't blow? How much of capital is at risk, et cetera. There's been very strong interest from international investors who also want influence and control. They're strategic investors. They don't want to be minority investors in these. But that's changed. The first projects in round 4, which had majority South African ownership and 50% black ownership in projects, were solar projects which the Old Mutual business invested in. So that's starting to change. And it was a consortium of black entrepreneurs who were the BE shareholders in those. But this is not unique to renewable energy. This is the whole challenge of doing economic empowerment in South Africa, which is the people you're trying to accelerate ownership and equity to don't have a lot of capital. On the second point you raised, which is Sun Exchange, it's a very, very cool business because one of our interns, Shamika, actually joined them. She's got a permanent role with them. And they do very cool stuff, like they crowdfund for schools and that. So they go to a school and say, we will come in and install a solar system for you and reduce your exposure to load shedding and your electricity cost. And we will crowdfund it. So you pay a contribution towards it, but everybody else can join into this and earn a return. I think those business models are not the business I'm in. I'm a bit too old and a bit too set in a very corporate structure. But I think that a lot of the young people who work with us, especially in those new jobs that I spoke about, performance analysis, data science, a lot of them in the next 5 years will be setting up little businesses, consultancies, doing things that, I never thought about. So a lot of them will be doing very cool things, I think. And I recognize we've run over time, and it doesn't look like the other people from the panel are coming.
Yes, no. Yes, I just wanted to ask a question. Because
Yes.
I've been listening now. It means that we even move away from wind energy to a political economy questions now that we've been asked. But
I prefer to go back to wind energy.
yes, no, exactly. No, the reason why I'm asking, because there's a narrative, to me, that suggests to say that as a country we must move towards renewables and then forget about your coal and everything else. I want, from your own experience and understanding globally, there's any single country that has got a base load from the renewables, because of if there's no wind, it means that there's no electricity. If there's no sun, it means that there's no electricity. So therefore, I just want to able to understand that. 1, 2, in your last 10 years that you've been in the industry, how much contribution did you contribute to the grid? Because of, remember before, you are not allowed to sell to municipalities. It's just a new thing now, just came up, including the big industries. But to Eskom, how much did you contribute from the renewables in terms of percentage for, to capacitate Eskom with regard to that? And the reason why I'm asking that question is deliberate, because I know, for example, that the city of Cape Town wants to get out of the grid to stand independently and able to use the renewables only. But I know that when anything might go wrong, they'll come back and want to attribute it somewhere else, because of they're saying that the renewables is the easiest way to able to get more investors for them to able to come in. But yet there's no strategy of how are you going to able to balance the baseline as compared to renewables. Yeah, I'll just leave it there for now.
Okay, well, I think, again, I'm not speaking for the wind energy industry, but I can tell you that, my personal view is that for the region, at least for Southern Africa, that you need a combination of thermal, which can be gas and coal, together with renewable energy to provide that stable system of diversity and power when you need it. And that'll be at an affordable price. But I think It's not a question of renewable versus coal. I think it's, how do you do both in a smart way that makes sense from a jobs perspective and a social impact perspective? Because we've spoken about the energy transition, and that's why I encourage you to watch that video on YouTube. It's by, grassroots activists in the area and the communities in the area. And what they're saying is, we're tired of the talk by government. We want some real action on delivery. What's going to happen before all of the towns in Mpumalanga and Witbank, which are affected by the shutting down of Komati, et cetera, are going to be ghost towns? So I'm just checking. I'm not holding up the agenda, right? But is there anybody here from the panel? Sorry. Because
Thank you so much for that very informative presentation and just the progress about how the wind energy is going about and its impact on youth and the opportunities available. So now we are going to the second panel discussion, which will be hosted by the lovely Noluthando Zulu. Just a brief background, she's the managing director of Dwala Mining, which is 100% black female owned mining company, and they're going to be discussing the topic jobs of the future.
We're just confirming where our third panelist is. Thank you both for joining. So I am joined by Dessen and Mapum from Esethu from the Black Management Forum. And basically we're going to be talking about the jobs of the future. And when I was told I'd be discussing this topic, I looked at my career. I started working underground in 2012. Someone outside reminded me that I am no longer the youth, I'm on the higher level of youth. So yes, I started working 10 years ago, and when I was working underground, it was real underground mining. It was intense, it was pick and shovel. It was what mining used to be. Hard, intensive, laborious work. Today, people are able to sit in an office in Sandton and see what's going on an underground operation. The mine of the future does not look like the mine that I walked into 10 years ago. And in that short space of time, new jobs have been created in the mining industry that have made the industry to be less labor intensive, and we've seen the shedding of jobs within the industry which I come from. So when waging a war on poverty, the greatest way to wage a war is by looking at the masses. Looking at how do we ensure that we bring the masses along. And we could look at two examples in history. In the 1970s, the US government went on a huge war on poverty, and they started putting people to work. And the same thing happened in the early 2000s in China, and that's how we saw that massive surge in the commodity prices as China became the factory of the world. So I think the real discussion I'd like to have is that there are two primary themes when we're talking about the jobs of the future that present themselves. That is decarbonization, as we've heard that lovely presentation on what renewable energy means for this country and the world going forward. And of course, the theme of technology. But the problem with these two themes, looking at them at face value, is that they come across as extremely elitist. You had mentioned jobs of, we need civil engineers, we need data scientists and data analysts. And knowing the fact that to pull people out of poverty, knowing the massive unemployment rate that we have in this country, the question I'd like to open this discussion is, looking at the fourth industrial revolution and the decarbonization story being the key drivers of how we create new and better jobs in this country, how do we not leave poor people behind?
Is that for you?
It's for both of you.
I think it's a really, and thank you for that question. But I mean, I think, this is the real discussion I think that South Africa should be having, because we've been trying to drive a national infrastructure program since the National Development Plan was written, and I think we failed at it. So the construction industry has been completely decimated. It's been a great entry position for unskilled labor. And I think renewable energy may not be the largest creator of jobs in construction, but for many people, one of my former colleagues who works at a wind farm says to me, it was the hardest thing he's had to do is go sit down with the construction crew and say to them, well done, you just built this wind farm, which we completed in round 4, but we've got no other work. You guys have got to go back to your communities, and hopefully you've managed to save something during this time. The only answer I have is that, South Africa's got to have this continuous infrastructure drive, because it's good for the country, and it's good for unskilled labor.
Absolutely. I think, one of the key things, especially looking at the room and hearing the questions that were being put to you, and obviously having had sat on many panels myself discussing the just transition, what is it about the renewable energy sector that seems to be so spooky? People get highly emotional when someone talks about renewable energy. People get highly emotional when they hear the term decarbonization and moving away from primarily using coal. Does the renewable energy sector just not have a great marketing team? Or what is it that just people can't get behind it? Because I think you've heard the sentiments in the room. It is a bit of a three-eyed monster that's hiding behind the door. Why?
Shall I take that too? Yeah. Okay. No, I think it's because the South Africans, reflect back to your own experience during COVID. As South Africans, our national response to being told what to do is not, yes, we will obey. It's kind of, I'm not sure this all makes sense to me. What's the secret agenda here? So I think that's one thing, is we don't like to be dictated to as a country, because we know we've got these amazing coal resources in the northern part of our country. And we don't like being told that because the rest of the world has decided that clean energy is what they want to do, that we should do the same thing, because we have our own development agenda. So I think it's fair to be skeptical and to be cynical and to question the logic and to interrogate the facts. But I have a different experience of renewable energy, not only because I work in it, because my first investment was in a coal-fired power station. And I've seen energy and delivering the lowest cost energy as being the first most important thing for South Africa. The fact that you do it in a carbon-intensive way is a secondary issue which has become more dominant in recent years, but it's not the main thing.
So from my perspective, I like that you made the examples of China and which other country? And the USA. For me, and I think for us as the BMF, there literally can be no sustainable political stability if Black people don't have a meaningful stake in this economy and in the management and ownership of this economy. So, countries like your Chinas and your USAs decide what is most important to them. And for us in the BMF, the lifting of millions of Black people out of poverty is a much bigger priority than becoming carbon neutral, for example. If you look at those kinds of countries, I think even the Japans of the world, I remember someone telling me a story that in Japan, you still have a person pressing the floor of the lift, in the lift. You have someone employed to press the button for you to go to the 10th floor.
Yes.
Not because technology has not advanced to a level where you don't need that person doing that, but because they want their people to have a sense of purpose. And for me, we as South Africa are still very much at a place where we should be looking at the most labor-intensive sectors and saying, how do we pour investment into labor-intensive sectors so that we can lift our people out of poverty? Because without that, we can be the greenest country on earth, but if 50% of our population is living in abject poverty, then we are going to wonder why we continue to have riots and uprisings and people, you know, even the xenophobic attacks are just a manifestation of frustration of people who literally have no sense of purpose and are giving up hope. And you know, one of the most dangerous things you can have in a society is people who've got nothing left to lose. And in South Africa, looking at the fact that 46% of people are on social grants, which means that they're relying on maybe the 350s. We have got a whole lot of people who've got nothing left to lose. And that is a very dangerous situation to be in. So for me, I'm still in a space where I'm saying, as a country, maybe manufacturing at the time that China decided to turn China into a factory, it might not have been the sexiest thing. It might not have been the most technologically advanced thing at the time, but that they made that decision and that's how they lifted. I mean, there's like 1 billion people in China, and most of them are gainfully employed and they are masters of their own destiny. What we are creating is a socialist dependency state that is simply not sustainable, because by the same token that, you know, when the finance minister said in the budget, 46% of South Africans are now on some form of social grants, I looked at him and I couldn't tell whether he was saying that with pride or with shame. I couldn't actually figure it out. Because it's one of the most scariest things. And so for me, and I besides being a part of the Black Management Forum, I work in the construction industry, and the reconstruction and recovery plan that the president announced, I think it was in August 2020, you know, just after the decimation of COVID, it was premised upon a massive infrastructure spend, and that meant turning this country into a construction site. And I cannot for the life of me figure out why we have not done that almost 2 years later. So, I mean, we'll engage further, but for me, that is our absolute starting point. Everything else is secondary.
And I completely agree, and I don't want to turn this into a renewable energy seminar. We are discussing jobs of the future, and you made a very fantastic example looking at Japan and how they still have someone who's in the lift who presses the button for you to go to your floor. You look at jobs that no longer exist, right? So in the Middle Ages, there used to be someone who was the clock, a person who their primary job was to tell you what time it was. There used to be someone in the movie theater who had to actually play the movie on the projection. That is no longer the case. In South Africa, for example, we still have petrol attendants, where in many countries, such as the US, those jobs no longer exist. But we are we are currently global citizens, and while we have to pour funds from a government perspective into turning this country into an infrastructure site to ensure that we pull as many people out of poverty as possible, in talking about the jobs of the future. And it's a pity that we don't have an individual from the government to speak to us here. The key thing we need to focus on is skills and skills development. And there have been some programs that are in townships, that are in rural areas where our masses are currently sitting. Do you find that those are actually effective? And are they imparting the right skills on our people to be able to fully participate in what the economy, not only locally, but globally, will look like going forward?
You know, what I've seen in my career in the companies that I've worked with is the issue of, for example, taking in interns, training people, educating people, but not being able to employ them at the end of the day. And so this comes back to one of our other sort of passion points of the BMF, and that is all this stuff that we're talking about actually hinges on one thing, and that is GDP growth or economic growth.
Yes.
So when we saw the finance minister was it March, I think, he spoke about the country growing by 1.8% in the next 3 years, when all indications are that we need the country to grow by about at least 6% in the next 10 years in order to change things around. And so it almost feels like the government itself doesn't believe in its own reconstruction and recovery plan. It doesn't believe in its own growth plan for the country. And I started by saying, we can focus on skills development. We can focus even on training people to be data scientists and wind and solar, the careers that were put on the board, which I think is absolutely fantastic and very exciting for young people to be going into careers that we didn't even know existed 10 years ago. I think that is phenomenal. But all of that goes back to an economy that is actually healthy and growing. And so for me, I listen to so many discussions, and until I get a sense that government actually believes in their own strategy and turnaround plan, all of these things kind of fall on deaf ears for me. So the way that we kind of look at the economy as the BMF is we look at the private sector, we look at the public sector, and we look at entrepreneurship. And our kind of tagline is developing managerial leadership. So when we look at the private sector, we as the Black Management Forum focus on developing Black managers to work in the private sector. You would hear us on TV and radio every time we feel that an untransformative appointment has been made. We will kick and scream and shout because we know that it is very important for Black people to rise up the ranks of corporate. We never discount entrepreneurship, SMME, and Black people starting businesses, but we've got to make sure that we have touch points at every part of the economy. So in the private sector, we focus on developing managerial leadership and creating a critical mass of Black managers who are going to rise to the top and become captains of industry. So whilst we need SMMEs and entrepreneurs, we also need Black CEOs. We also need Black chairs of boards, because 70% of the economy of South Africa is in the private hands. So we can't leave that to, and I'll be very frank and say we can't just leave white people to their own devices in 70% of our economy. And the reason why we're so passionate about having Black people in those positions is because in those positions, decisions about hiring, about promotions, about incentives, about remuneration, about strategy, about culture are made in those boardrooms. And so we need to be in those boardrooms. We can't just leave that space and say, okay, let's go, Tina, and be entrepreneurs. But those people who want to be entrepreneurs, we also support them. We've got an SMME desk in the BMF. We've recently launched the Insika Impact Fund, where we will be funding Black SMME businesses, and we've identified a niche market of probably between 1 and 5 million rand, because most private equity and even the development finance institutions tend to look at bigger turnover companies and also tend to have very, very onerous requirements. So we're looking at easing that for Black entrepreneurs, and we're saying as the BMF, we are putting our money where our mouth is, and we're getting even these corporates to actually sponsor the Insika Impact Fund so that we can do this. So we want to touch public, private sector, as well as in the SMME space. In the public sector, we continue to call for an ethical state. Colleagues, let's not forget that the public sector and the SOEs were actually meant as the backbone of this economy. So you find, I know Dito Mboweni had his own turnaround plan, I forgot what it was called, but in there he spoke a lot about network industries, and that's where the the SOEs are. That's your Transnet, that's your PRASA, that's your Eskom, that's your water boards. So everything that forms the backbone of this economy in terms of transport, in terms of water, in terms of energy, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of all those things, even digitally. And if you look at the Department of Digital Communications, SOEs are meant to form the backbone and to stimulate this economy. So as the BMF, that's why we continue to call on SOEs to go back to being growth engines of the economy instead of piggy banks of the few. And that's how we dissect this economy. And every single discussion that we have just goes down to saying this economy needs to grow. That is just the bottom line from our perspective.
If I may, you had touched on quite an important point that you advocate for as the BMF within the corporate space, and that is seeing black leaders rise to the very top of organizations, seeing black leaders take up space in executive offices, in boardrooms. How are black leaders who are walking into those rooms and closing the door behind them being held accountable by the BMF? Because I can list multiple examples of leaders who have risen to the top, who have surrounded themselves with white executives, who have surrounded themselves with white juniors, who have not only kept the door open, but said, let me go back outside and pull those young black people into this room and expose them and show them what can be done and help them get to that next level. How are those leaders, from a BMF perspective, being held accountable? If they are.
It's interesting that you asked that question. So previously, we haven't really held them accountable. We've watched them, we've commented about them on our WhatsApp groups, but we've never really tangibly held them accountable. And I'm glad that you asked this question at a time where we've actually decided to do a study, not just on, so, you know, you've got to start somewhere when you do your own studies. And we've decided to look at the black investment holding companies. Most of these actually born out of the original BEE deals, etc. And to say, we want to look at black-owned companies, maybe not even black investment companies, and say who are the executives in those companies. So never mind the executives in corporate South Africa, but who runs black-owned so-called companies, because we do have a sense that even before we get to corporate South Africa, in fact, in our own businesses, we have a sense that black people like to surround themselves with white executives. I mean, I heard something very funny saying the reason why, I was speaking to a businessman about this, and he says, no, when I speak to people, they say they don't want a black CFO because black CFOs see how much you make, and then they go and talk about it in circles of people who actually know you. Whereas if Danny Marie wants to go and talk about your salary to other Dannies, like, you know, nobody actually gets to, you don't get exposed. So apparently there's this phenomena that we don't want black CFOs because they get to know too much about us and how much we're worth, and, you know, and so we are conducting that study. We've started on it. And I think because we want to hold ourselves accountable first, that's where we wanted to start before we then go into corporates and say, you're a black CEO, you're a black chair of the board, where are the black executives?
Okay, fantastic. Well, when looking at the jobs of the future, as I had mentioned, the key themes being decarbonization, being the fourth industrial revolution, and in his past State of the Nation addresses, the President has mentioned the fourth industrial revolution and how important it is to bring young people along, and how tech-savvy these young people are, and how it could really open up doors for young entrepreneurs within the space. But we still find ourselves in a space where the highest barrier as young entrepreneurs in these new spaces, in these new rooms, is access to capital. So how should the banking system change in order to make way for the new unknowns in terms of the new jobs that are coming within the future?
Look, I think banks are under pressure to do more because they're seen as being in a very powerful position to enable, you know, catalytic growth, but they're not doing enough. And it goes back to your point is, you know, the private sector is a huge play in the economy, and the private sector is able to create more jobs at a faster pace. I think just the one area, just as it springs to mind, I was talking about all of the economic development activities, but we have an obligation in the renewable energy industry to create enterprise development jobs or to support businesses in those communities around the Eastern, Western, Northern Cape. And our struggle is finding entrepreneurs. So this is not bank capital. It's not huge capital, but for different types of startups, whether it is a company that wants to set up security services firms. We've got a very interesting business who wasn't around 5 years ago, which does drone scans. So they fly over a solar park, they take thermal images of a solar park and can identify which panels have hotspots and need to be inspected more closely by the site team. Those drone inspections also happen on wind turbines. But the point is, all of these businesses are in more established centers like Port Elizabeth, Johannesburg. We have enterprise development funding available in the Western Cape, Northern Cape, and Eastern Cape, but not a lot of entrepreneurs tapping into it. So I think that's one suggestion I have. About banks, I think the big thing, and it goes back to what the BMF is trying to do, if I think back to why do banks lend to people, it's not only do you have a balance sheet, it's do you have a management track record. And unfortunately, as a startup entrepreneur with no track record versus somebody who's worked in a corporate, who's managed people that can say, this is what the corporate's done, this is what I've done, you can trust me. I think it supports your ability to get finance.
So on the banks discussion, because I've worked in a development finance institution, again, when I speak about the public sector needs to go back to what it was intended for. Development finance institutions were meant to bridge that exact gap. So whereas a bank will say, I want to see your equity contribution or skin in the game, I want security, I want your track record, I want to know, they'll dissect your business. And that's fine because they're putting their capital at risk. But then what are the DFIs there for? One of the economists I like is very controversial. I hear the ANC doesn't like him very much. Duma Kubule. He always says, this thing of government debt and fiscal austerity measures hasn't worked for us in the longest time. And he says, don't look at government debt like your household debt or your credit card or your store card kind of debt. It's not like that. It's not Edgar's, It's not Truett's. It's not like, no, guys. And you look at countries like the US, whose government debt is sitting at like 133%. And I'm not advocating for reckless fiscal management, but I'm just saying, if only our government put money in effective places, then we wouldn't be so worried about government debt as such. If we had confidence that the debt is actually being used to then stimulate the economy and then create taxes that go back into the fiscus and it becomes a virtuous cycle. And so that's where the DFIs are supposed to come in. That's where government is supposed to capitalize these DFIs so that they can put because capital, if you put your capital on the table, you dictate the terms. So when I was working at the Land Bank, you would get a government guarantee to go and borrow money from the World Bank and from international DFIs, and they then put the terms on the table because it's their money. Yes, it's sovereign guaranteed, but the sovereign guarantee thing is not as easy as people make it out to be. Just because people have lent you money on the back of a sovereign guarantee does not mean that you can then go and use their money in any way that you like. They actually dictate your credit policies. They dictate what it is that the criteria that people need to meet in order for you to use their money. So if we had more government money in development finance institutions, then the government is the one that will actually dictate to the SOE to say, with this pot of funds, we want you to increase your risk appetite and give people a chance. And I always look at like a Silicon Valley type of project in the US. That is a government-funded and created a project where people were given money to go and figure stuff out. And a lot of those a lot of those startups failed dismally. People lost money. It was a whole thing. But you have to take some risks in order. So if the US decided they want to be the technology capital of the world, then they needed Silicon Valley, and government had to stand behind that. And so we need our government to decide what it is that they want to focus on, and then put their money where their mouth is. And then we won't worry so much about these austerity measures that now in government meetings people mustn't be given tea, and all of these other ridiculous austerity measures things.
You know, we were having a conversation earlier on at lunch, and the conversation was all about information and access. And I think I heard a quote saying, equality is not everyone living in Sandton. Equality is not everyone living in Campston. Equality is that wherever you are, you have access to information, access to resources to be able to make a decision. So whether you're in Kaya Nation, whether you're in Langa, whether you're in Soweto, whether you're in Sandton, you need to know what is a data scientist. And you need to know if you have the skills to be able to make that a possibility for you or not. And unfortunately, when it comes to the jobs of the future, one of the key issues that we have is that young people in this country do not have access to information equally. You speak about Silicon Valley, and I want to speak specifically about that example because we have a Silicon Valley in this country. One, the Stellenbosch, yes, it's our Silicon Valley, and that's a group that came together and decided they were going to fund each other's projects. And we've seen incredible successes with the likes of Capitec, with the likes of the ShopRite Checkers that we all shop at. But I'm sure none of you have heard of AP Ventures. Who's heard of AP Ventures? AP Ventures is a collaboration between the Public Investment Corporation and Anglo American Platinum that was started in the year 2017. And the intention of this fund was basically a venture capitalist fund to go out and find young people in this country who had ideas around platinum. How do you use platinum? And there was a project that was picked up, and currently Anglo American is building its first hydrogen truck because of one of the ideas that came out of that AP Ventures. But young people do not have access to this information. You mentioned something very important, the fact that you're looking for these entrepreneurs, but these entrepreneurs are looking for you. Where do we find a way of bridging the gap of the venture capitalist and the young boy sitting in Langa who wants to build a truck using platinum? And I think that's the question that we have to ask ourselves is, who should be driving that? And who are the key players, and how do we ensure that people are not left behind purely from a lack of information? That speaks to access.
Yeah, so what you're saying reminds me of something that shocked me when I worked at the Land Bank. So there were companies that were thriving financially from charging people to help them to access grants. That for me was mind-blowing.
Yes.
So your whole business model is built upon charging people for you to be the conduit between them and accessing government grants. Because the grants themselves are hidden in the most obscure places within a department somewhere, and you need to know somebody and you need to do something in order to actually access them. And that's why those businesses are financially viable, because people will actually pay to access a grant because of lack of information. And you know, I'm not saying that I've got a solution, but that's just one example that literally blew my mind. And I think it's something that's very, very scary that happens in this country. And the only thing that I've thought about is that this information needs to be distilled from national departments to local government, to communities, through church leaders, through whichever mechanism, traditional leaders, church leaders, community leaders, but it cannot stay at national government Department of Agriculture, because people don't know how to reach the national, the National Department of Agriculture. And government is not very good also at making these things accessible, even, on a website, and also making people fill out a whole lot of forms and putting the exact barriers that, a bank might put. So you're a government department, except you want me to go to your website, use my data, fill out whatever it is, send in information, it goes into some black box, there's no feedback, there's nothing like that. So we've got to get these grants and pockets of money that are meant, and what's sad is that government actually spends a lot of money on these initiatives. They actually spend a lot of money on these initiatives. But what will shock you is the amounts of money that have to go back to National Treasury at the end of the financial year, because we can't find people, or the worst I heard was when government had, during COVID, a 200 billion, I think it was part of the 500 billion that people say government ate 500 billion. So part of that 500 billion was a 200 billion that was a credit guarantee scheme that said to banks, we will back you up for this, to lend people this 200 billion, and we will take about 75%, I think, of the loss, of the credit loss. So increase your appetite for losses, because we will back it with this 200 billion. I don't even think 10% of that was spent during COVID. And part of it is probably just because people just can't understand, what is a credit guarantee scheme? What does it mean for me? Where do I go? Do I go to the branch?
How does it work?
Or, that kind of thing. So that's something that seriously needs to be looked at.
Yeah, I think that last example is a great initiative. There was a group of economists, South African economists, who came up with this idea to help the country out. And it was an implementation failure, because there was no accelerated funding to entrepreneurs. There were businesses that started to go bust, especially in the restaurant and catering industry. But they didn't know about these lifelines. They were trying to get the jobs support, for short-term salaries, but they didn't realize you could actually borrow money on concessional terms. And by that time, it was too late.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for the conversation. We are done. I don't know if there are any questions, but I think some key notes. Yeah, I think my question's at the back there.
Hear me? We are running overtime, so we're not going to be able to do any Q&As at the moment. But just one question.
She's already standing up.
Don't kill
Just
me.
one question for her.
So we're just going to do the one question, and then we're going to wrap up.
Hey, thanks for giving me that opportunity. I have one question, but for each speaker. I hope I'll be allowed.
It's true.
But yes, for SA2, I just like to first applaud and appreciate the mindset you have about lifting people from poverty, especially as a chartered accountant. I think a person would rather lift somebody out of poverty than save costs. That person needs to be appreciated. But I'd also like to raise the question, as you are in the construction industry. The construction industry is one which has experienced a productivity growth index much lower than that of the whole economy. That being due to its low levels of innovation and basically how comfortable the industry is. I would just like to ask, how can we rather bring innovation within the industry, but also now lifting people out of poverty through your trainings, through having more projects rather than one capital-intensive project, and rather increasing our cost efficiency within the construction industry. That is my question to you, and then to the brother within renewable energy. Mine is the renewable energy industry itself is one which seems to forget about how we should not only be looking at production, but usage. You know, the smart usage of smart energy usage within the country. You know, and as your company itself, is that something you guys are looking at, number one, investing in within research and development? And are you guys open to such initiatives that will essentially make energy usage of the country much more sustainable? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So I'll start with the caveat that I'm not an engineer or a construction expert by no means. I look after the finances of Grünecker LTA. However, I am learning. I think I've been in the job for about 6 months now. No, not even 6 months. So as Grünecker LTA, I do know that we've recently completed the building of NMU, so the Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth, the residences, and that was done using alternative building technology. And that has been quite widely publicized in engineering news and all the publications, and we are definitely moving towards using a lot of that alternative building technology going forward. So we also do have interns training. We've got our own Grünecker LTA training academy where we train people in the skills of the construction sector. And some of these ideas for these alternative building technologies come out of our training center. So we are looking at mechanisms of making construction more efficient and using technological advances. But whilst trying not to let that then mean that we employ 50% less people because of those technological advances. I think your other question was around, I can't remember, but I know I wanted to make a point to say, you know, the construction industry, we don't build buildings for ourselves, right? We build buildings for private and public sector. So our civil engineering business builds roads, bridges, dams. That is public infrastructure. So if you sit with a SANRAL who's got 16 billion rand of tenders that are adjudicated but not awarded because of whatever political instability is happening at a SANRAL, then the industry is bound to suffer. And that's what we're seeing in the construction industry right now, is that because, and I hate to harp on this, guys, but it always comes back to that, because our economy is simply not growing. The private sector is not building huge buildings, and the public sector, where then we can build roads, we can refurbish roads, we can build infrastructure. As I mentioned, the president always talks about a massive infrastructure spend. That has not happened at all. And so the ability of the industry to absorb jobs is hampered because of the economic situation, basically.
In response to your question, I wish that my company had the mandate to look at smart metering and the other side of the electricity equation, which is the demand side. But our shareholders have given us a very specific mandate. We can only look at generation and the utility scale generation. But there's lots of other businesses who are looking at that, which I think is quite an exciting way to manage the energy system.
Well, thank you very much. And with the parting shot, when I was in grade 10, I read an article. I was a nerd. Yes, I was reading articles in grade 10 already. And it was basically about economic upliftment and how to create jobs. And the economist who was asked, I don't remember his name, I think it was an American economist, and he said, creating jobs is the easiest thing in the whole world. All the government has to do is build roads. And the person who was interviewing him asked, well, how does that create jobs? I mean, you just build the road. And he said, think about it. Think about the most rural town you know. It's probably a gravel road. The minute the government spends money putting up the road, Checkers now goes, oh, my truck can actually drive on that road. Checkers goes and builds a Checkers in that rural area. Now, there's a Checkers in that rural area. Pick n Pay goes, well, they're making a lot of money. I should go and build a Pick n Pay in that area too. You now have a Pick n Pay. You know what? So many people in this area are working. We need another clinic. And development starts happening the minute people can access areas. So I know there aren't many government officials here in the room, but let's get up and let's build roads. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Yet another informative panel discussion, and a great thank you to our guests today. They're just going to get a young token of appreciation from one of the organizers, and a very, very huge thank you to everyone that has come through. And yeah, I'm going to now hand over to my amazing host on my right. Co-host.
Sorry guys to have cut you short to that panel, and it was very fruitful, very informative, and it would have gone on for a much longer time because it was just so informative. Thank you so much to each and every one of you for staying and for being really interactive with our panel and with our guests throughout the day today. But without any further ado, please put your hands together for the President of the South African Youth Economic Council, Kana Kana.
Forward with jobs for young people, forward. Forward with business opportunities for young people, forward. Young people who are in the room, esteemed guests, our partners, I greet you all in the name of freedom, revolution, and jobs for the youth of this country. Without wasting any of your time, I just want to take this opportunity to kindly thank all of you guys for participating in the first day of our inaugural Youth Jobs Imbizo. We do know that this is one of the most prominent and important events that need to be held on an annual basis, because the 74% youth unemployment rate in this country is way too abnormal. It is unjustified that South Africa, with the potential that it has, currently sits with the largest unemployment rate globally. And it's going to take all of us who are present in this room to solve this problem with the rigor that it deserves. So this is why it is quite important for all of us to be here today. But without any further delay, colleagues, allow me to take this opportunity to thank Hawaii, to thank the Petroleum Agency of South Africa, to thank the City of Cape Town for taking part in this prestigious, esteemed event. We truly believe that through dialogue, through stakeholder relations, we are going to, in one way or the other, solve the problems that we are confronted with as a country. Allow me to also extend a hand of appreciation to all the youth organizations in Cape Town that took the opportunity to come and be a part of this initiative. We thank you guys. But most importantly, allow me to thank all the young minds, all the brilliant young minds that presented themselves to this occasion, that duly participated in this event. Without you guys, this wouldn't have been possible, and we thank you for that. Today must serve as a clear way of announcing to the private sector, to the government, that young people by themselves are capable of convening such an event, and they are capable of making remarkable impact in South Africa, particularly when it comes to solving our problems. I said it when I was standing over there, that it is quite impressive that young black women in this room are meaningfully contributing to energy conversations. Young people in this room are discussing how the ICT industry must impact young South Africans. We sat here, discussed how the construction and infrastructure development must impact South African SMMEs that are owned by young people. That is the first step towards reconstructing and rebuilding an economy that is favorable to young people. And working together, I have no doubt that we are going to do more for that young person who is selling fruits and vegetables in Langa, for that young person who is in Venda, who wants to program and in one of the good days create a mini Silicon Valley in South Africa. It takes us coming to this room, speaking and engaging with government stakeholders and telling them that we are ready. We don't want to get jobs in the future. We don't want to meaningfully run this country tomorrow, but we want to do that today, and it must start now. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know today we started a bit earlier because the mayor had commitments, so he decided that he can only be with us early in the morning. Now, as a quick announcement, for our day 2 occasion, we are going to start at 11 o'clock, and we hope that you guys are going to be able to present yourselves, because tomorrow we have the Deputy Minister of Finance, who presides over the budget of our country. So he must tell us a certain portion of that budget is going to go to funding young people and to making sure that young people in this country have jobs and business opportunities. Tomorrow in this very room, we are going to have the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Mr. Gwede Mantashe, who must tell us how a young person with a dream of owning a petroleum company or a mining entity in South Africa can be assisted by the department. So it is of paramount importance that we go all out there, encourage many more other young South Africans to come and be in this very room, meaningfully contribute to our discussions, so that at the end of this Imbizo, we have a document that we can present not only to this government, but to the continent as well, to say a young African who resides in Langa or who resides in Khayelitsha envisions to live in an Africa that looks like this. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that today you were able to network. I hope that today that COO of that agency that you want an internship from, you must have his number by now. I hope that Mintech, that is capable of giving you a business opportunity, you now know who to reach out to. And don't be afraid of reaching out to those people. The managing director of Globalac is here. You must go to him and tell him that I graduated from UCT in 2016. I have a master's in this kind of category, but I still don't have a job. He is here, and if he can identify potential in you, he must give you a job. That is why we have these gatherings, colleagues, so that you must live here not just with a wise quote to say when you are somewhere else, but you must live with a job, with a contract, and with a business opportunity. That is why we are here, and we must use these networks. So colleagues, let's not be selfish. Let's go and extend a hand of invitation to our other colleagues that may be wherever in the city of Cape Town to come tomorrow and meaningfully participate. Our program starts at 11. It is going to run till 4 o'clock. We'll make sure it's very brief and very short. But before I officially close this event, I must state that as a council, we are proud to announce that all the service providers that meaningfully contributed to this event, except for the Western, obviously, are young black professionals. The beautiful hosts you see over there are young graduates, some from the University of Cape Town and some from AFDA, whom we identified and we said, you guys deserve an opportunity. As much as this might not be your niche, we believe in you because you are young. We are going to empower you until you get it right, because that is the South Africa we want for young people. Ladies and gentlemen, I guess we shall see each other tomorrow. And with the powers vested in me, I officially close the first day of the South African Youth Economic Council Jobs Imbizo. I thank you.